A social media prankster gets too close to a royal guard, hungry for viral fame. This soldier is about to become my ticket to 1 million views, he tells his livestream. The guard stands frozen, looking powerless, until the prankster makes one touch too far. But what happened next will shock you. The crisp autumn air surrounded Buckingham Palace as tourists from around the world gathered in respectful clusters, their phones and cameras poised to capture the iconic changing of the guard. Red-coated figures stood like statues, their bearskin hats adding nearly a foot to their already imposing height. Most visitors maintained a reverent distance, speaking in hushed tones as they admired this centuries-old tradition. Among them, 25-year-old Jake Collins moved differently. His eyes darted between the guards and his phone, where his latest TikTok video had garnered only 50,000 views. With his styled hair, designer streetwear, and a Bluetooth camera attached to his baseball cap, Jake stood out from the typical tourists. His channel, Prankster Jake, had recently hit 500,000 followers, but growth had plateaued, and his engagement metrics were dropping. "This is going to be epic," Jake whispered to his friend Mark, who reluctantly operated the secondary camera. "These guys are trained not to react to anything. But everyone has a breaking point." What many visitors like Jake failed to realize was that the King's Guard weren't merely tourist attractions in decorative uniforms. These were elite soldiers, members of one of the oldest regiments in the British Army, with a history dating back to 1656. Many had served in combat zones around the world before taking on the ceremonial but vital duty of guarding the royal residences. Their stoicism wasn't just for show, it was the discipline of highly trained military professionals. Jake didn't care about any of that history. He only saw content, engagement, and the viral potential of being the one to make a royal guard break character on camera. Jake positioned himself strategically near the sentry box, his eyes tracking the precise movements of the guards as they performed their duties. Mark stood a few feet away, nervously adjusting the settings on his camera while their friend Zoe scrolled through social media on her phone, occasionally glancing up with obvious discomfort. "Guys, this is going to blow up," Jake insisted, watching as a family took photos from behind the designated white line painted on the ground. "Look at these amateurs. Stand back, take a picture, leave. Boring. No one's going viral with that approach." He pulled out his notebook, sketching a crude map of the guard positions and their patrol routes. For the past week, Jake had visited Buckingham Palace daily, timing the guards' movements and noting when they rotated positions. Today wasn't a random prank, it was a calculated performance. "I've got it all planned out," he explained, showing his notes to his reluctant crew. "We start small, see what we can get away with. Then we escalate. By the end, one of these guys is definitely breaking character." Zoe frowned, pointing to the clearly posted signs surrounding the area. "Jake, it literally says, 'Do not touch the King's Guard' right there. And look at those white lines on the ground. We're not supposed to cross those." Jake scoffed, tucking his notebook away. "Those are suggestions, not rules. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? They're not allowed to do anything. They just stand there looking pretty for the tourists." He adjusted his cap camera and checked that the wireless microphone was working. His previous pranks, bothering restaurant staff, pretending to faint in crowded places, fake proposals in expensive stores, had all gotten decent views. But he needed something bigger. "Look how many followers these Royal Guard compilation channels have," Jake said, showing his phone to Mark. "Millions of views just for videos of guards yelling at people. Imagine how many we'll get if I can make one actually lose his cool." Mark reluctantly nodded, though his eyes betrayed his anxiety. "Just don't go too far, man. These guys are actual soldiers. That's what makes it perfect." Jake grinned, watching as a guard marched stiffly to his position, rifle at his shoulder. "They can't touch me. They can't move. They can't say anything. They're literally paid to just stand there and take it." With his props ready, a silly hat, a microphone with the logo of a fake news channel, and a list of increasingly absurd questions, Jake prepared for what he was certain would be his most viral content yet. The warning signs and barriers around him might as well have been invisible. Jake began his performance with the basics. He edged closer to the guard stationed outside the sentry box, a tall, impassive soldier identified by the insignia on his uniform as a member of the Grenadier Guards. The guard's eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking despite Jake's proximity. "Hello? Earth to guard dude." Jake waved his hand near the guard's face, careful not to make contact just yet. "Anyone home? Blink twice if you're being held against your will." A few nearby tourists chuckled, while others shook their heads and moved away. Mark filmed from several angles, capturing both Jake's antics and the stone-faced guard. "Maybe he's actually a wax figure," Jake announced loudly, proceeding to pull exaggerated faces, crossing his eyes, puffing his cheeks and sticking out his tongue. The guard remained unmoved, his discipline impenetrable. After 5 minutes of increasingly childish facial expressions yielded no reaction, Jake stepped back, visibly frustrated. "Time to level up," he muttered to Zoe, who handed him the prop microphone with obvious reluctance. Jake donned a ridiculous oversized bowler hat with a Union Jack pattern and approached again, this time holding the microphone uncomfortably close to the guard's face. "Breaking news. We're here live with one of Britain's most talkative personalities," Jake announced in an exaggerated British accent. "Sir, what are your thoughts on the pressing issue of whether jam or cream goes first on a scone?" When this too failed to provoke a response, Jake grew bolder. He positioned himself directly in the path where guards were known to march during patrol changes. As a guard approached, performing his precise, ritualistic steps, Jake deliberately remained in place, forcing the soldier to alter his route slightly. "Oops, sorry mate, didn't see you there," Jake called out with mock innocence, while Mark captured the moment the disciplined routine was disrupted. A small crowd had gathered by now, some filming on their phones, others watching with expressions ranging from amusement to evident disapproval. An elderly British woman muttered, "Disgraceful," loudly enough for others to hear, while a group of teenagers snickered encouragingly. "Jake, maybe that's enough," Zoe suggested, noticing a palace staff member speaking into a radio nearby. "You've got plenty of footage already." "No way," Jake replied, irritation creeping into his voice. "I haven't even gotten a reaction yet. These guys are too good." He checked his phone. The live stream had a decent number of viewers, but the comments were mostly urging him to push further, to cross more lines. For his next attempt, Jake produced a small portable speaker from his backpack and began playing recordings of military commands, deliberately incorrect ones, at high volume. Several tourists jumped at the sudden noise and a child began to cry. "Jake, seriously," Mark lowered his camera. "This is too much. There are kids here." "Just a little more," Jake insisted, his eyes locked on the guard who still hadn't acknowledged his existence. "I'm going viral today one way or another." He approached the guard again, this time close enough that their faces were barely a foot apart. "Come on man," Jake whispered, no longer performing for the camera but genuinely frustrated. "Give me something. Anything. I know you want to punch me right now." The guard's eyes remained fixed, looking through Jake as if he were nothing more than air. And for a moment, genuine doubt crept into Jake's mind, maybe he couldn't break these guys after all. Desperation fueled Jake's next move. His video wasn't getting the reaction he needed, both from the guard and from his viewers. Comments scrolled by, "Boring. Do something crazy. Make him move." His metrics were tanking in real time and with them his patience. "Last chance," Jake muttered, pulling on a pair of novelty gloves shaped like cartoon hands. He sidled up to the guard, whose expressionless face remained fixed forward. Behind him, Mark lowered his camera slightly, already sensing what was coming. "Jake, don't," Zoe warned, her voice sharp with alarm. But Jake had already committed. With deliberate slowness, he reached out and placed his hand on the guard's shoulder, then gave it a light shake. "Hello? Anybody home?" The transformation was instant and terrifying. "Stand back from the King's Guard." The soldier's voice exploded like a cannon, echoing across the courtyard. In one fluid motion, he pivoted, rifle shifting to a defensive position as he stamped his boot against the pavement with a crack that made everyone within 20 feet flinch. Jake stumbled backward, nearly falling as his foot caught on uneven ground. His prop microphone clattered to the pavement. The guard's face remained professional, but his eyes locked onto Jake with an intensity that communicated everything words couldn't. This was not a game. I was just, Jake stammered, but his excuses were drowned out by the approaching footsteps of two uniformed police officers who had been stationed nearby. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Several people applauded the guard's response. Others pointed at Jake, explaining to the officers what they had witnessed. The elderly British woman who had earlier voiced her disapproval stepped forward. "He's been harassing this young soldier for nearly half an hour," she told the police. "Absolutely disgraceful behavior." Phones were raised all around, but they weren't filming Jake's prank anymore. They were documenting his humiliation. Jake could see his own shocked expression reflected in dozens of screens, could hear the murmurs of disapproval rippling through the gathered tourists. "Sir, I need to see some identification," one officer said firmly, while the other spoke into his radio. The guard had already resumed his position, as impassive as if nothing had happened, though his eyes occasionally flickered toward the unfolding scene. Mark and Zoe stood apart from Jake now, their expressions a mixture of embarrassment and relief that the escalation had finally stopped. The live stream continued to broadcast, but the comments had shifted dramatically. Got what he deserved. Respect the guards. What did he think would happen? For the first time, Jake realized with crushing clarity that he had completely misjudged who had control of this situation. Name and passport please, the officer demanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jake fumbled for his wallet, painfully aware of the dozens of eyes fixed on him. His cheeks burned with embarrassment as he handed over his identification. The second officer addressed the crowd. Please step back and continue with your day. No one moved. The public spectacle of Jake's downfall was apparently too compelling to miss. Do you understand that interfering with the King's Guard is a criminal offense? The first officer asked, examining Jake's passport. These soldiers are on active duty protecting a royal residence, not participating in your entertainment. I didn't think, Jake began. Clearly, the officer interrupted. He gestured to Jake's camera equipment. We'll need to take that. What? You can't? Jake protested but fell silent at the officer's stern look. We can and we will. All recording devices, please. They contain evidence of your harassment of military personnel. Mark silently handed over his camera. Zoe unclipped the backup phone they'd been using for wide shots. Jake reluctantly removed the hat-mounted camera and surrendered his phone, still broadcasting to a rapidly growing audience witnessing his humiliation rather than his triumph. Am I being arrested? Jake asked, his voice smaller now. You're being detained while we determine the appropriate charges. Harassment, trespassing, interfering with official duties. The Crown Prosecution Service has several options. As Jake was escorted away, notifications flooded the officer's evidence bags. His prank was indeed going viral, but not as he had envisioned. Clips entitled Prankster Gets Shut Down by Royal Guard, and Justice for Disrespecting King's Guard, were already being shared across platforms. His comments section was flooded with viewers expressing satisfaction at his comeuppance. Outside the police van, Jake glimpsed his friend standing awkwardly, unsure whether to wait or leave. He also saw the guard, still at his post, still professional, still in complete control, as he had been from the beginning. Other tourists resumed taking respectful photos, maintaining their distance behind the white line Jake had so deliberately crossed. The worst part, the officer informed him as he closed the van door, is that your video will likely be used in training as an example of what not to do at Buckingham Palace. 6 hours and a substantial fine later, Jake sat alone in his hotel room. His confiscated equipment would be returned before his departure from the UK, but his pride would take longer to recover. His social media accounts overflowed with negative comments and unsubscribes, the algorithm now working against him instead of for him. Through the blinds, he could see Buckingham Palace illuminated in the distance. The guards would still be there, performing their duties with the same discipline they'd shown for centuries. Jake opened his laptop and began typing. I want to publicly apologize for my behavior today at Buckingham Palace. What I thought would be a harmless prank was actually disrespectful to the royal guards and British tradition. I've learned that these soldiers aren't props or attractions, but highly trained professionals with a serious responsibility. He paused, remembering the guard's unwavering composure until the exact moment intervention became necessary. That wasn't weakness, it was discipline and restraint. I thought I had the upper hand because I could act however I wanted while they had to maintain composure. I was wrong. They were in control the entire time, trained to handle people like me while carrying out their duties. Jake hit post without adding any hashtags or calls for likes. For once, the engagement metrics didn't matter. What mattered was the lesson he'd learned about respect, boundaries, and who really held the power in that encounter.